All right, now that you've finished those sections, everything in Chapter 4 and that first part of Chapter 5, 5.1, you're ready to start reviewing for the first test. Now, remember, I'm breaking the unit tests down into smaller tests so that they won't be quite as daunting or as big. So hopefully it'll only be 20 questions or so, somewhere in that range. A little bit easier, but not as time consuming for you, hopefully. So I want to go through right now just the stuff that you need to make sure that you understand and are ready for that test. If there's anything here that you have trouble with, please reach out to me somehow, whether it's Google Classroom or email, and we'll try to clear up any misunderstandings that you might have. I'll also try to do a live Zoom probably tomorrow for anybody who may be struggling or has questions or anything like that. Actually, maybe Thursday. Maybe we'll do that Thursday. Either way, let's go into this really quickly. So the first one is you need to be able to define species, population, community, and ecosystem. So those were some of the first terms that we went through in one of the first videos. Make sure you're comfortable with knowing whether two organisms are a different species or not, and how a species is different from a population, or how a community is different than a population or a species, and how an ecosystem varies from all of those. So if any of those terms are fuzzy to you, make sure you go back, review those videos if you need to, and if you need to, reach out to me and we can go through it. The next one, 1.2, is explain how terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems support a diversity of organisms through a variety of habitats and niches. So we talked about terrestrial ecosystems in terms of some of the forests and the areas around here. We also talked about aquatic areas like the littoral zone, limnetic, profundal zones, benthic zones. What we didn't get into specifically is the example they give here of a terrestrial. We just didn't use these terms, but they apply. So in a terrestrial ecosystem, for example, in a forest, there would be the canopy, would be the very, very tops of the trees. The subcanopy would be kind of just below that in the middle. And then you got the forest floor and then things in the soil. We did talk about maybe not using those terms, but how they work, though, in terms of niches. If you remember that there were some birds that only fed or nested in the very tops of the trees, while others were in the middle and then others were at the bottom. That variety of habitats or areas within an ecosystem allowed them to each have different niches and avoid some of the competition or the fighting that might happen in between those species. Same thing in the aquatic ecosystem. Some things like to be in the littoral zone, some like the limnetic, and some would be in the profundal. And that separation allows for more species to exist there without having to have conflict with other ones. 1.3 is identifying the biotic and abiotic characteristics that are in these ecosystems and explaining their influence. So the ones that we specifically talked about, we talked about a terrestrial ecosystem and an aquatic, and some of the factors like temperature and rainfall and pH and all of those things that we mentioned. I think there's a lesson on each of those on how it affects terrestrial and how it affects aquatic ecosystems. Don't focus as much on the specifics of how it affected that ecosystem, but try to expand and think, how would this apply to any terrestrial ecosystem or any aquatic ecosystem? What are those abiotic and biotic factors that are going to have an influence there? If you can get to that level, then you're doing pretty well. The next one, explain how limiting factors influence organism distribution and range. So we didn't talk about distribution and range, but we did talk about limiting factors and how a lack of food, for example, would keep a population from growing too high. We talked about the law of the minimum, or the law of tolerance, that say whatever you have the least of is going to hold you back, and that there is a range where you like to live. Because of that, for example, butterflies don't do well in the Arctic. It's too cold. That's below their ideal temperature range. So most of the time when you have a species that lives in a specific area, it's a result of kind of the law of tolerance. They live in the area they can tolerate, with temperatures and water availability and food and nesting sites. They tend to live and thrive and survive best in an area where they have everything they need. If they go somewhere where they're outside of that zone, they're not going to do very well, and they may even just not be able to survive if the conditions are harsh enough. So that's how they're applying that, is taking what we talked about with those laws and with those concepts of limiting factors and using it to describe why you have certain birds in this area and not those same birds over here, or maybe certain trees. Like why do we have so many more pine trees in a certain area and not as many deciduous trees? Those would be examples of thought-provoking questions that might help you work your way through something like that. And then this last part right here is explain the fundamental principles of taxonomy and binomial nomenclature. That's what we just did in 5.1. It's a short lesson. Hopefully it made sense to you. And using basically modes of nutrition at the kingdom level, meaning at that broad level we're looking at, for example, are you an autotroph or are you a heterotroph? And really broad characteristics, and then getting down to some very specific morphological characteristics or like physical descriptions is what that would really mean at the genus and species level, where we're getting to the point where you're talking about the difference between this species of elk and this species of elk, and it may be a very small difference between them. So very broad characteristics at the kingdom level down to very, very specific characteristics at the species level and the genus level. So that's kind of a gist of everything that goes. Now that doesn't cover every little detail, but those are the broad strokes. In each of those broad strokes, you may have smaller pieces you need to dive into a little bit more. But if there's anything there that you have trouble with or you need some help with, don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions. I will help you out as much as I can. The test will probably open up on Thursday, and then you'll have a chance probably for about a week to get in and take that test whenever you feel like you're ready for it. We will start moving into the next section next week. So it might be a good thing to try to do all your review and stuff this week and even take the test this week to get that out of the way so we can move on to the next chapter. That way next week you won't have to be focusing on trying to do the test and keeping up with chapter 5. We are going to have to move pretty quick going forward to try and get everything done with only 2 or 3 lessons a week. That condenses things. So I'm going to just be hitting on the highlights of anything. If there's anything that ever piques your interest that you want more information about, just let me know and I can pass that your way. But we'll just be hitting some of the highlights to get you through Bio 20 and be ready for Bio 30 next year. Some of the stuff that I think will be more important for you without completely overwhelming you with too much stuff. So that's kind of the idea. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to me in whatever way you prefer, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right? Best of luck. If you have any questions, let me know.